Okay, gentlemen, if you have your study guides, we're actually in page number 13. A little bit of what we talked about last week was dealing with the various different translations and what's the difference between all of them. Dan just arrived, and so we looked at the fact that there are basically three types of translations. Do you remember what they were? If you got your books open, you can figure it out. Okay, there's literal, there's free, and what's the other one? Dynamic equivalence, okay? And you remember the difference? Free translation, if you go back, I mean the literal is something like King James, which is very literal. The difficulty with that is, unless you have an understanding of history and the context of culture, it can be difficult to understand. A free translation is something that, just like I said, is very free, usually referred to as a paraphrase. Something like Living Bible, Good News for Modern Man. Basically, it's not a doctrinal book, just somebody just put the Bible in their own words, usually to help those who have limited understanding. And so it's not a doctrinal book. It may be good for devotions, but it's not a good study Bible. Then you've got the dynamic equivalent, which is an attempt to take the original language and bring it up to date. Taking words that we don't use today and exchanging it for a word that we understand, but also means the same thing. Examples would be, if the Old Testament uses a word like a lamp, we don't really use lamps, but we understand the word, let's say like a flashlight. Like the word is a lamp unto my feet. Today we would understand that as, okay, a flashlight is something that helps guide me in my direction as I'm walking. And so a dynamic equivalent attempts to use words that we understand today while keeping the true meaning and the context of it. And some of those newer translations are things like maybe NIV, the Message, or maybe a few others that bring things pretty much up to date. So that's a difference in some of these different translations. So we went as far as page number 13. Again, some examples there, like read some of the scriptures where the Bible talks about giving people a holy kiss. Well, we don't go around kissing each other. Today it would be more like a handshake. You greet each other with a handshake. So that's what a dynamic equivalent is, okay? So let's kind of go on. At the bottom of the page there, we'll start. Okay, the way various translations handle the problem of historical distance can be seen by looking at some of the problems involved. And the first example is that of weights, measures, and money. This is a particular difficult area. So do we translate the Greek and the Hebrew terms ephah, homer, etc., or do we try to find their English equivalent?
I'm sorry, sir. What page are you on?
Oh, we're on 13, Mike. Bottom of page 13.
The very last paragraph.
Very last paragraph. Weights and measures.
You're not supposed
This
to.
was put together different.
Oh, wrong. There's actually two sections.
Oh, okay. Oh, never mind.
Okay. Yeah, should mention that actually the study guide is actually in two sections, part 1 and part 2. So I didn't realize there are 2 page 13s. So the thing is, do we translate these words leave them the way they are, or do we choose to go with the equivalents like pounds and feet? Or do we look more to the future and translate these words as liters and meters? Or no matter what we choose, in just a few years, inflation will have made a mockery out of your translation. So the difficulty in finding an equivalent can be at times not too easy to do. So, like I say, it was feet and inches. Now we do what? Meters, kilometers, so terminology changes. So the difficulty with translations is, what do we do? 10 years from now, there may be completely different words used. Take a look at a couple examples over page 14. Couple of different translations. You've got forum in your thing there, Lewis. Would you have the NASB? We're just opened up to Isaiah 5:10. Dan, can you find Matthew 18:24? What translation do you have, Mike? I mean, Dan.
I got the King James.
Okay, look up King James. What do you have, Chester?
I got King James and a Message.
The Message? Okay, look up the Message. Matthew 18:24, and then verse 28. What translation do you have, Mike?
Which one do you want? I got, no, I just got some on my phone that I downloaded. There's, I got ESV, King James, NIV,
Okay,
James, NIV.
use NIV and look up Isaiah 5:10. Now, there are a couple others here if you have, but okay, Lewis, Isaiah 5:10. What have you got?
For 10 acres of vineyard will yield only 1 bath of wine.
Okay, you notice that translation there? They translated into acres. What have you got, Dan? Dan, you did what? Matthew 18?
I'm on Matthew.
Matthew 18:24.
Want me to read that?
Yeah,
Just 24 or 24?
24 and 28, yeah. Go with both of them.
And when he begun to reckon, one who was brought unto him, which owed him 10,000 talents. You want me to go through?
No, just do 28.
But the same servant went out and found him one of his fellow servants, which owed him 100 pence. And he laid his hands on him and took him by the throat, saying, Pay me that thou owest.
Okay, Sunday, you got two words there, talents
Talents.
and pence. Chester, can you read the same verses in your message?
My message, starts off with 23. Maybe I could
Go ahead,
throw that
it's
in.
fine.
Okay, the kingdom of God is like a king who decided to square accounts with his servants. As he got underway, one servant was brought before him who had run up a debt of $100,000. He couldn't pay up, so the king ordered the man, along with his wife, children, and goods, to be auctioned off at the slave market. The poor wretch threw himself at the king's feet and begged, Give me a chance, and I'll pay it all back. Touched by his plea, the king let him off, erasing his debt. 28. The servant was no sooner out of the room when he came upon one of his fellow servants who owed him $10. He seized him by the throat and demanded, Pay up now.
Okay, you understand the difference between a literal and a dynamic equivalent? So in the literal, you've got talents and pence. Dynamic equivalent, you've got $100,000 versus what, $10? So that gives you a better perspective on really what that message is about. Because we think, what's a talent? What's a pen? We don't understand that. So the dynamic equivalent, such as the message, brings it up to date. It's a lot easier for me to understand the term $100,000 or $10 rather than so many talents and so many pence. Mike, what did I give you?
Isaiah 5:8.
Okay,
The,
Isaiah 5:10.
Yeah, that is, 10-acre vineyard will produce only a bath of wine, a homer of seed will yield only an ephah of grain.
Okay, very, very similar then. So you understand the difference in translations. So it's important sometimes to have several of them. I like the literal translation, but I also like the dynamic equivalent, such as the message or some other translations that kind of take those words. The Amplified Bible is another example. If you have the Amplified Bible, generally it will give you in parentheses the various words that same original word can be translated into, which gives you a better idea. You going to say something, Lewis?
Yeah, actually it does, yeah.
Okay, what does the Amplified say?
For 10 acres of vineyard shall yield only 1 bath of wine, and a homer, 6 bushels of seed, will produce only 1 ephah of grain. What an ephah is,
So there's no parentheses in those
No.
sections? Okay, so some of them do.
No.
Okay. Secondly is euphemisms. Anybody know what a euphemism is? Almost all languages have euphemisms, okay? For matters of, okay, here we go, sex, using the toilet. And so the translator has basically 3 choices. Now, if you know anything about this, if you go back to the story of Elijah. Remember Elijah and the prophets of Baal? And there's that one verse where it talks about Elijah. Well, maybe your God's off pursuing, which literally means maybe he's going to the bathroom. And so the dynamic equivalent is going to try to use words that we understand exactly what's going on. So here they got three choices. Translate literally and leave the English-speaking reader somewhat bewildered or guessing, Or two, translate the literal equivalent and run the risk of offending or shocking the reader. Or three, translate with an equivalent euphemism. So understand the difficulty, okay? What word do you use? And sometimes no matter what you do, someone's going to be offended. In fact, I've read many, many stories of young people of other countries being offended by reading the scriptures because sometimes it's just right there, okay? So option three is probably the best. Examples. To have Rachel say, I'm having a period, Genesis 31:35, is to be preferred over the literal, the manner of woman is upon me. So do you understand that? So in King James, the manner of women is upon me. Basically what it says is, I've got my period, which is why she refused to get up at that time. So that's the difference between literal and dynamic equivalent. So when the translation says, I'm having my period, we understand exactly what she's talking about. Okay? Or similarly, in 2 Samuel 13:14 said, he forced her and lay with her. Well, very simply in the NIV, he raped her. Okay? That is the dynamic equivalent. Instead of beating her around the bush to say he forced her and lay with her, the actual meaning is he actually raped her. Okay? So you understand the difficulty there. Some people would be offended by those terms, but that is the literal meaning of what's going on there. It's also possible for a translator to miss the meaning of a phrase, such as 1 Corinthians 7:1. Okay? The NIV says, it is good for a man not to marry. Okay? The phrase, to touch a woman, in every other case in antiquity means to have sexual intercourse with a woman, never means anything close to marry. The NAB version has found the preferred equivalent. A man is better off having no relations with a woman. So again, sometimes even translators try to translate it into something that makes it easier for people to accept. Okay? So now we go to vocabulary. It is finding the precise right word that makes the translation so difficult. Many Greek and Hebrew words have ranges of meanings that are different from anything we have in English. We've talked about that before. And many of these words can have different shades of meaning. Okay? Which translation then should we read? Well, the NIV, the Message are a good translation, good as you can get. GNB, NAB are also very good. So the point is we need a very good translation. The more translations you have, the better. Now, I mentioned the assignment last week. Over the next couple of weeks, try to get some of these things done. You're on your own on this, but it says, study the book of 1 Corinthians. We're going to spend a good deal of time in the book of 1 Corinthians. Set aside at least 1 hour. Read the entire book in one sitting, using your preferred translation. If anything catches your attention, write it down so you don't forget it. So basically, you're going to sit down, take an hour, read it from cover to cover, 1 Corinthians. And as you're reading and something strikes you, you don't understand, you got a question, just write it down so you'll remember it. Secondly, then use a good commentary, a Bible dictionary, maybe a Bible encyclopedia. Find out everything you can about the city of Corinth at the time of Paul's writing. This is extremely important because we'll deal with it a little later when we get the epistles. You need to understand what was going on in that town. What's about their culture. When you understand the culture, you understand the historical context of what's being written and why he is actually writing what he is, because every town has specific problems, okay? If we go to the book of Revelation, we got the message of the 7 churches. When you read the background of those 7 churches, you understand exactly what John is saying right now, or what Christ is saying to these churches, because otherwise they don't make sense. So we got to understand what's actually going on. Thirdly, you've read it through quickly. You check the background, found out everything you can about Corinth. Reread the book again, but this time slower. Try to compare it in at least 2 other translations and take notes. Pay particular attention to, and here are the 4 things. Who is he writing to? Why is he writing? What's the problem he's addressing and why? And what advice or counsel does he give? Then if you want, break it down into an outline. So the point is, when you're doing a Bible study, you got to know these 4 things. Number one, who's he writing to? Why? That's the whole point of the book. Why? And in every situation, the reason is usually because of problem. We're going to find in Corinthians there were several problems. And so he will address them one by one by one. And what advice or counsel does he give when he addresses these problems? And then our task is, after we know what Paul is saying to them, how do we apply that to ourselves today? This was written over 2,000 years ago. Okay, so how do we apply those biblical principles to us today when we don't live in that culture? We have a different background, our teaching is different, our language is different. So how do we apply that to ourselves? That's what we need to talk about a little later. Okay, any questions so far on any of these things? Okay, page 16, we come to the epistles. And again, the epistles are completely different from other books of the Bible, okay? One of the reasons for starting with the epistles is that they appear to be so easy to interpret. After all, who needs any special help to understand that all have sinned, Romans 3:23, or that the wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23, and that by grace you have been saved through faith, Ephesians 2:8. I mean, so we look at these verses and we think, okay, those are easy enough. So why do we need to spend a lot of time here? Well, on the other hand, the ease of interpreting the epistles can be quite deceptive, especially in a book like 1 Corinthians. For example, how is Paul's opinion in 1 Corinthians 7:25? A couple of you look it up in your translations. Let's do King James, let's do the Message, and whatever else we've got here. Find a translation. Look up 1 Corinthians 7:25 and let's see exactly what Paul is saying here. You got it, Mike?
Oh, I'm sorry. I have it.
Okay, what translation do you have?
Like I said, this one I'm looking at is NIV.
NIV, okay. What does it say?
Now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who, by the Lord's mercy, is trustworthy.
Okay, who else has got that?
Got amplified.
Okay, Lewis?
Now concerning the virgins of marriageable age, I have no command of the Lord, but I give my opinion as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy.
Okay, Dan, do you have a version?
Yeah, I got King James.
King James?
Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful.
Okay, Chester, do you have the Message? 1 Corinthians 7:25.
The master did not give explicit direction regarding virgins, but as one much experienced in the mercy of the master and loyal to him all the time, all the way, you can trust my counsel.
So, understand what Paul is saying here. He's dealing with a topic, and we'll understand the topic a little later in 1 Corinthians. He says, this is something, God hasn't told me this. So he's drawn a line here, okay? To this point, when I say, listen, God has been speaking to me. This is exactly what God wants you. However, this part here, this is my opinion. So God hasn't given me this at all. But this, because of God's grace, what I've learned about God, this is what I'm going to tell you. So the point is today, how do we accept it? Do we accept that this is God's word? Where Paul said, this is my opinion? What do you think?
Well, it's his opinion, but he's basically an apostle, so even he has communion with God. So you should have some idea of God's opinion on it.
Yeah. So essentially, what he's saying is, listen, God didn't tell me this, but essentially everything he says is biblical. There are principles in Scripture. And he's dealing with some difficult situations in the Corinthian church. And we'll get to those a little later. And so what he's saying is, here's my opinion about what's going on here. Okay?
Can he also basically base that on his experience with all the churches?
Oh, yeah.
So And
Yeah.
for me, that was basically simple. If his judgment, I know his opinion, and I know what God's word is. I think most of us, and all of us know that we study the word of God. We know what he's saying.
Yeah.
Because with him, he tells us automatically if it's his or God's.
Yeah.
And I trust him because this is the man. Well, everybody knows what he went through.
Yeah.
Right. And whatever he says, I know what you went through. I know what's going on. So it was when I read it, it was okay.
Yeah.
I've read before where he stated he was a Pharisee of Pharisees.
Oh yeah.
So as far as the Old Testament goes, he didn't even need to look at it. He knew it by heart.
Correct.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. He was.
So essentially, too, we'll learn a little later. The whole book is really a book on correcting some real difficult situations, and I don't envy the guy. Okay, I mean we'll deal with it a little later, but all these rumors are coming back to him on what's going on in the Corinthian church, and he said, "Listen, here's my opinion." Then he goes on and gives some biblical counsel. Okay, so it's his opinion. So how do we take it when some are going to dislike the implications of his opinion? And there will people that will say, well, that's just his opinion, therefore it doesn't matter. Well, not exactly. Okay, so let's go on. How does the excommunication of the brother in chapter 5 relate to the contemporary church? Especially when they can simply go down the street to another church. Okay, you understand that? Now, again, I have faced this in ministry. Okay, I have actually faced this. Back then, once you were kicked out of a church, you had no place to go. That was it. You couldn't go down the street to the next church down the street. Well, I'm going to go to the First Baptist Church. You couldn't do that. Today, oh, okay, I'm just going to go down to this church. And one of the things we lack today is and too often times, and again, because I face this in ministry, where somebody under discipline leaves the church, and the first thing they do is they immediately go to another church. Now, if that pastor is on the ball, the pastor will then call this person's previous pastor. That's what's supposed to happen, to make sure, because I've had this happen. I've had people come in, and I've called the pastor, and oh yeah, there was these problems, and I'd have to tell them, listen, you go back, and you get things right with that pastor before you come here. What happens today is too many people, we don't ask questions anymore. Oh yeah, you're welcome, you're welcome. And what happens is I had a number of people that would bounce from church to church to church, and the other pastors, nobody asks why. They'll pop in for a few months and go somewhere else, and da-da-da-da-da. And so Paul deals with this, and we'll get to that when we get to that chapter, the fact that how do we handle it? And where today, like I say, you can go to another church. And that's the problem, you know. And so pastors don't check on the background of a lot of people. And I made sure when I was pastoring, the one thing I did when somebody came, oh yeah, I used to go to so-and-so's church. Well, I know the guy. I would actually give that pastor a call. And if there was no problems, fine. You know, but if the pastor, well, yeah, we had some problems here, and then I'd have to sit down with that person. I'd actually tell them, you need to go back. And until you rectify your situation there, I'm sorry, you're not welcome here. And that sounds harsh, but you have to do it. And the one thing we lack today in a lot of our churches is this lack of spiritual discipline, where people in the church, and I guess you're going to find out a lot of parallels between the church in Corinth and the church today. A whole lot of parallels where sin is allowed to fester and leadership doesn't want to deal with it. And I see it all too often. Well, you know, everybody's not perfect and whatnot. But I've been in churches where people not living godly lives are put into ministry positions, leadership positions in the church, because the leadership of the pastor doesn't want to offend them, doesn't want to lose them. And that is what is wrong. That is completely what is wrong. I remember a gentleman told me one time that upset says, "Now, if I leave this church, and my money goes with me, what are you going to do?" I said, God doesn't need your money. Fine, leave. You know, and that's the point. We've got to be upfront and give it to Paul. Paul never beat around the bush, and you'll find that just a little bit later. So here we go with that one, dealing with excommunication. So what is the point of chapters 12 to 14? Okay. If one is in a local church where charismatic gifts are not accepted as valid for our century, and how do we get around the clear implications of chapters 11, 2 to 16, that women should wear hair covering while praying and prophesying? So again, it's the difference in culture. And I told people before, if you're in a community looking for a church, you can't find a Pentecostal church. The only church is available, maybe it's a good Southern Baptist or another Protestant church. They don't accept the gifts of the Spirit, some of these teachings. Your job is to be there and not make waves. Okay, you understand that? In other words, it's not an issue. Okay, whether you believe in speaking in tongues or not has nothing to do with whether you go to heaven or not. And this has happened where people will go into a church and believe it, and they'll put up a big stink. You know, you're not believing the Bible. No. There's a series I did years ago. In fact, I just wrote these down a few days ago. I forget what it was. Difference of standards. You know, there are. I'll have to bring them back another time. But one of them deals with cultural issues within a church. Every church is different. Okay, every church is different, has different dynamics, and our job when we find a church is to fit in, not create problems. Okay, so it becomes clear that the epistles are not as easy to interpret as is often thought, because again, the difference in culture, the difference in history. We don't dress like they do, we don't talk the way they do, we don't have their customs, therefore we've got to learn how do I apply this to today, okay? Now, the nature of the epistles, okay, at the bottom of page 16. Before we look specifically at 1 Corinthians, some general words are in order about all the epistles. All of the New Testament except the 4 Gospels, Acts, and Revelation. There is one thing that all of the epistles have in common, and this is the crucial thing to note in reading and interpreting them. They are all what are technically called occasional documents. Otherwise they arise out of an intended and are intended for a specific occasion. They are far from the first century. Although inspired by the Holy Spirit, thus belonging to all time, they were first written out of the context of the author to the context of the original recipients. It is precisely these factors that they are occasional and they belong to the first century that makes their interpretation difficult at times. So, the word occasional, okay? The occasional nature must be taken seriously. This means they were called forth by some special circumstance, either from the reader's side or the author's. Usually the occasion was some kind of a behavior that needed correcting, or a doctrinal error that needed setting right. So you understand, the purpose of the epistles is completely unlike the Gospels. It's unlike the book of Acts. It's unlike the book of Revelation. Every epistle was a letter written for a specific reason. There was a problem, okay? So that is our task when we read the epistles. What is the problem? Then how do we deal with this problem? So most of our problems in interpreting the epistles are due to the fact that they are occasional. We have the answers, but we do not always know what the questions or problems were, or even if there was a problem. It's much like listening to the end of a telephone conversation and trying to figure out who is on the other end of what that unseen party is saying. The occasional nature of the epistles also means that they are not, first of all, theological treatises. There is theology implied, but it is always task theology. Theology being written to bear on the task at hand, okay? You understand that? They're not specifically doctrinal. They're dealing with a problem. However, in dealing with a problem, we have some theological questions answered. Does that make sense? You look confused, Mike.
I'm good.
You're good. Okay. So we need to keep that in mind. Oh, well, for some reason I lost my video here. Okay, now we go down to historical context. The first thing one must try to do is to form a tentative but informed reconstruction of the situation that the author is speaking to. What was going on in Corinth that caused Paul to write 1 Corinthians? How did he learn of the situation? What kind of relationships and contacts has he had with them? What attitudes do they and he reflect in this letter? These are the kinds of questions you want to answer to. So the point is now, what do? So we have to understand this. First of all, you need to consult your Bible dictionary or the introduction to your commentary to find out as much as possible about Corinth and its people. So that's the first thing you do. Now, that's one of your assignments. Find all you can about Corinth. Secondly, develop the habit of reading the whole letter through in one sitting, which I ask you to do. Nothing can substitute for this exercise. It is the way one reads a letter. You are not looking to grasp the meaning of every word or sentence. You're simply looking for the big picture. So understand it. Okay? These are letters. So when the church received the letter, they simply read it from beginning to end. So when you read it from beginning to end, you get an overview of what's going on. You're not really studying it, but you're getting a picture now. There's something going on here. Then we go back and we try to pull it apart and understand what he's saying. So remember, the purpose is first of all to reconstruct the problem. For this, we suggest you take 4 kinds of notes. Number 1, what do you notice about the recipients? Are they Jew, Greek, wealthy, slave? How about their problems? Or is there an attitude problem? Secondly, what's Paul's attitude towards this? Thirdly, any specific things mentioned as to the specific occasion of the letter. Otherwise, why is he writing it? And fourthly, the letter's natural logical divisions. You'll find out, especially in Corinthians, that it neatly divides itself up into various areas. He deals with one topic, then goes on to the other topic, etc., etc. First, you read it, go back, quickly skim through the letter in order to pick up on these items. Who is he writing to? What kind of people are these? Can you pick up on the problem that he's dealing with? Etc., etc. Okay? Page 19. We're not going to go too far this morning because I do have to head off here fairly early. So what do we know about the city of Corinth? And again, I want you to do some of your own studying. Okay, the Corinthian believers are chiefly Gentile. Also, there are also some Jews. They obviously love wisdom and knowledge. I got several scriptures there for you. They are proud and arrogant. We're going to look into that a little later. Yet they have a large number of internal problems. So here we go. We've got Gentile Christians, we've got Jewish Christians, we've got people that love wisdom and knowledge, they're proud, they're arrogant, yet they got a few problems, okay? Thirdly, Paul's attitude towards all this fluctuates between rebuke, appeal, and exhortation. So he's going to lay it into them, okay? He's going to appeal to them. It's like saying, please change. Then he's going to give some good words. So this isn't all just one-sided type of thing. I'm not just here to yell at you guys, okay? I'm going to let you know, here's the problem, okay? Now, here's my suggestion. Please. And then at the end, he'll say some good words for you. He'll try to lift them up. He's not going to leave them down in the dumps. He's going to give them as much information as possible. And listen, you guys have got to take care of this. And here's how you take care of it. And then he'll kind of end it on exhortation or better words, okay? Now, concerning the occasion of the letter, you might have noted that in chapter 1, verses 10 to 12, Paul says that he was been informed by people from Chloe's household, okay? In other words, people have been sending him notes. Paul, we have a problem here. And so there were those inside the church that noticed some things that were not right. And for some reason, the church leadership wasn't dealing with it, so they appealed to Paul now. So now we know, how does Paul know these things? People are telling them. Okay? Now, let's go on. Also refers to reported information in chapter 5, verse 1. But he says, now, for the matters you wrote about, which means he's also received a letter from the church. So, there are people that are writing him about what's going on. Now, you also notice the repetition of those two words, now about. In other words, these are probably all items from the letter that he's taking up one at a time. So what he's dealing here, there's obviously a number of problems, issues, and so he deals with them one at a time. Now about this. And he talks about it, then he goes, now about this. So he's dealing with each one of these specific problems in order, one at a time. Okay? Now, did you also notice, if you read it through the arrival of Stephanus, Fortunatus, and Archaicus, okay? Since Stephanus is to be submitted to, verse 16, it is certain that these men are leaders in the church. They probably brought the letters to Paul as kind of an official delegation. So there are these men that join Paul, and Paul's led in the Corinthian church, because Paul's not there, right? So, especially with Stephanus, adhere to him. This guy is here for others. Paul said, he is my emissary. You will do what he tells you to do. You submit to him. He is your leader. Well, I am not there. So as Paul is sending very specific directions along with his letter, listen to this guy. So I can almost imagine that he is the one who's reading the letter to the people. I just got back from Paul. Let me read to you what he tells you all. And Paul says, listen to him. Okay? Now we come to the matter of a working outline. The place to begin is with the obvious major divisions. Chapter 7 is where Paul first mentions the letter, while in chapters 1 through 5 he talks about the things that have been reported to him. There are a total of 4 divisions in these first 6 chapters. Okay? The first one is the problem of divisions in the church. That goes from chapter 1 up through chapter 4. The second is the problem of an incestuous man in chapter 5. In chapter 6 is the problem of lawsuits. And also in chapter 6, the problems of fornication. So now, look at this, guys. This is almost the story of the church today. We face the same problems. The Corinthian church was no different than us, or we should say we're no different than them. We run across the same problem. There are divisions within churches. People tend to separate. And in this particular case, well, I'm going to follow this guy. Oh, I'm going to follow this guy. Today we say, I'm going to follow this preacher. I'm going to follow that preacher. I'm going to follow this evangelist. I'd rather have this guy rather than this guy. And so we create divisions. And Paul says, that's wrong. That's wrong. And I've seen it over the years of ministry where people will just, if a particular preacher or evangelist comes to an area, oh, we got to go see this guy. And I remember in ministry that there were always these people who would go because, well, the power of God is there. Or if I go there, I can get healed. Or if I go there, I can bring my unsafe, and they'll get saved. Failing to understand, God is here as well as he's over there. So you got people, maybe we got to call them the God chasers, They try to chase God. And I had a couple families in the church that did that constantly. Somebody would come to town, or a particular church would have, they'd run over there. Well, because the presence of God is over there. So no, you said the presence of God isn't here? Well, no. So this is what was happening. These divisions within the church, where people were almost to the point of worship. There's Paul, we just accept Paul's words. Well, no, I'm going to accept this guy's words. And Paul says, he's got to deal with that situation, okay? Then you got the incestuous man. Now, this is hard to comprehend, but you got incest going on within the congregation. And what baffles the mind is the church knows about it. Does your mind even comprehend that? The third is lawsuits. Christians are suing one another. And if you read through the scriptures, Paul says you shouldn't be doing this. What's wrong with you guys? And of course, then fornication. You know how many churches won't even touch that topic today? Sex outside of marriage? Well, that's the way the standards are today. And Paul lays it on the line. The Bible's very clear. You're going to do that? Sorry, you're going to hell. Oh, but we can't tell people that. No, that's what we have to tell people. And we live in such a promiscuous age. I mean, it's terrible. You watch TV, or try to find a good movie, everybody sleeps with everybody. You understand that? I mean, that's considered the norm. And pretty much in the Corinthian church, they allowed it. It was the norm. You got to understand, again, the historical context. If you go back to ancient Rome, this is what happened. The orgies. And the problem is, it would come into the church. Because the church, well, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. That's where that phrase came from, And so, this is what's going on in the church. So, read through the scriptures. Try to understand what Paul is actually saying to the church. Chapter 7, the time what we got here, I got to close here. Actually, we're going to pick up chapter 7 next week, okay? Page 20. And so in the meantime, read 1 Corinthians. Look at the history, because we're going to get into the historical context next week on 1 Corinthians. Actually, I want to make sure you have plenty of time to read it. We'll go through the divisions. What Paul's going to say here, and meanwhile read it in a couple different translations if you can, and try to really understand what Paul is saying, and we can take time to talk about it, okay?